Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a text that deals with a pretty universal problem. How in the world do you find your way when everything feels chaotic and, honestly, just plain confusing?
So let's just start with that big question. When you're faced with doubt, with pressure, with a million different voices telling you which way to go, where do you find a reliable guide? Well, that's the exact problem a theological text called the 11th Flash sets out to solve. In this text, it doesn't just ask the question and leave you hanging. Nope. It proposes a very specific solution, and it frames it as, well, basically a spiritual compass for anyone feeling lost.
And that compass? It's a concept called the Sunna. Now, what is that? It's the whole package. The practices, the words, the actions, the entire personal conduct of the Prophet Muhammad. And the text presents this as the essential guide for living a meaningful life.
Okay, so let's dig into this a little more, because the author doesn't just call it a guide. He uses these really powerful metaphors. He calls the Sunnah an antidote for that spiritual sickness you feel when you've lost your way, and a stairway to help you climb to a higher state. I mean, that's pretty vivid, right?
Now, here's where it gets really fascinating. The text claims these practices aren't just about, formal rituals. The whole idea is that they have the power to transform your entire life, every single part of your day, into a genuine act of worship. And it starts with a bang. The text opens with this incredibly powerful quote from the Prophet. It immediately sets the stakes super high, showing just how much value is placed on following this path, especially when things in the world are kind of falling apart. It's not just a suggestion, it's presented as something profoundly significant. So, you might be asking, how does that actually work? Well, it breaks it down like this. Let's take something super simple, like eating or drinking. You do it every day, right? The idea is, if you just take a second to intend to follow the Prophet's example while you do it, boom. It's not just a habit anymore. It becomes a moment of recollection. You recall that he brought the divine law and your heart turns to God. Suddenly, that simple act becomes an act of worship. And that's really the key takeaway here. This isn't about just checking off a list of religious duties. It's about weaving this intention into the very fabric of your life. The result? Your whole life can become, as the text says, fruitful and yielding of reward. Pretty amazing when you think about it.
But look, this isn't just some abstract philosophical idea. The author gets really personal here. He shares this powerful story about how these very ideas became a literal lifeline for him when he was going through a massive personal crisis.
He talks about being caught in a terrible spiritual storm. Just imagine that feeling, completely lost, caught between your head and your heart, with no guide to hold on to. He felt like he was just being tossed around by his own doubts.
And he paints this incredibly stark picture of the difference it made. When he gave up the practices, everything felt dark. The pressure was intense, the load was just heavy. But when he came back to them, he says the pressure lifted, the way lit up, and he was saved from all those doubts. It's a complete night and day comparison.
And he really hits rock bottom. His crisis zeroes in on the reality of death. And the imagery he uses, wow. He says he saw himself as a corpse standing over 3 huge corpses. It's this vision of just total, terrifying oblivion.
But right there, in that moment of absolute terror, he finds his lifeline. A single verse from the Quran becomes what he calls a safe and trusty boat. It reminded him of a simple, powerful truth. Since God exists, everything exists. Nothing is ever truly lost. It just moves on to another one of God's worlds.
Okay, so the text makes a big shift here. It moves away from that really personal, emotional story and pivots to a straight-up logical argument. It's basically making the case that following the Sunnah isn't just a good idea, it's the only logical choice for a believer.
And this whole argument hinges on one specific verse from the Quran. It says, "If you do love God, follow me. God will love you." You see that? It creates this unbreakable link between the feeling of loving God and the action of following the Prophet.
The author points out that this is a classic piece of logic, what's known as a conditional syllogism. It's just a simple if-then statement. Like if it's raining, then the ground is wet. The text argues that because its structure is so simple and logical, its conclusion is just inescapable.
So let's break down the logic. The verse says, if you love God, then you will follow the Prophet. Simple enough. But then the author flips it. He says, okay, so if that's true, then if you don't follow him, what does that imply? The inescapable conclusion, he argues, is that you don't actually love God. So following isn't just a suggestion, it's the proof, the evidence of that love.
Okay, so if following the prophet is this crucial, what does it actually look like in real life? What are we talking about here? Well, the text makes it clear it's not just one big thing. It's actually broken down into different categories.
There are basically three main buckets. You've got the obligatory or compulsory stuff, that's about half of it. Then you have the voluntary practices, which are mostly about worship. And finally, there are the laudable practices, which are all about your daily conduct and manners.
So let's get a little clearer on what these mean. The obligatory, those are the must-dos, the non-negotiables. The voluntary, those are really encouraged, and trying to change them is seen as a big mistake. And then you have the laudable category. This is about following the prophet's daily habits, how he ate, how he spoke, you name it. And as the text keeps reminding us, doing this is what turns your regular habits into worship.
All right, so to wrap it all up, the text brings everything together. The Sunna isn't just a rule book, and it's not just a logic puzzle. It's presented as the absolute foundation for a life that's full of purpose and, well, beauty.
And the ultimate goal is summed up in one beautiful word, courtesy. It's about taking on a stance of pure courtesy before the Creator. It's about reflecting the beauty of God's names in your own actions and conduct. It's a really profound concept.
And the text drives this home by quoting the prophet himself, who said his sustainer taught him good conduct. He's presented as the perfect example of this, someone with a perfectly balanced character, who always avoided extremes. And that's what makes him the model to follow.
So there you have it. The 11th flash makes a really strong case that the Sunnah is the definitive compass for a believer. It's a whole framework for turning every single moment of life into something meaningful. Which kind of leaves us with a big question to think about, doesn't it? If you had to design a compass for your own life from scratch, what principles would be pointing you north?